Hey guys, my name is Rye. Today, I wanted to go over and talk about something a little different from my regular commentary series. In the past couple weeks, I've done a lot of feedback sessions and coaching which have looked at different ways and avenues of getting better at Mythic Plus. About a year ago, I released this video, showcasing and highlighting my biggest feedback for how I pug title in Mythic Plus on every role in Dragonflight, including tank, healer, and DPS. After having a rewatch, I still think a lot of this applies. But, however, there's a couple things that I wish I had talked about back then, and I wish now that I knew as a really beginner player. Specifically, today, I wanted to go over one of the most important reasons why I think a lot of players that I see and that I've kind of, had some time to sit down with or maybe help out in certain key levels are missing this really important factor in understanding how to do Mythic Plus properly. So today, I'm going to go over Ryerson Explains Priority Damage. Back in Dragonflight, we had a dungeon called the Algethar Academy. The Algethar Academy was a whimsical 4-boss dungeon that included the Overgrown Ancient, Croth, Vexmus, and our favorite Echo Doragosa. In this dungeon, there was a ton of AoE and a ton of big mobs. However, this was a pretty difficult dungeon for a lot of teams and a lot of pugs, as for some reason they'd always run out of time. In my mind, Algethar Academy was the #1 showcase of the dungeons in Dragonflight that showcased this thing very well, which is priority damage. When you go into the first boss room, you have something called the Overgrown Ancient. The Overgrown Ancient is a tree boss that spawns after you defeat all 3 detonating lashers in the room. The lashers are surrounded by skitterflies and as well these little lashers. Once the 3 detonating lashers die, there will be a 15-second RP to which the boss is going to engage. I'm sure some of you have gone into this room before, and if you did play back in Dragonflight, it would look something like this. You'd go, you'd tag all these mobs, and your DPS would AoE everything down. People would want to bring Warlocks, people would want to bring big AoE pad damage classes, but the thing was, if the detonating lashers didn't die, the boss was never going to spawn. So if you fought this pack for a lot longer than you needed to because you were AoE and clean everything down but never killed the lashers, this should be inconsequential to you being able to complete this dungeon and move forward. Why is this important? Now, in Algethar Academy, there was multiple sequences and series of events that would need you to beat up a big target before you could go on to the next checkpoint. On the next platform after the Overgrown Ancient, you had this winged defender guy who, unless you killed him and single targeted him down, would not allow you to progress. People often snap mobs on here, and as well you had the platform after, which had all these birds with one big bird. Until the big bird died, the next birds wouldn't spawn. Why am I talking about Algethar Academy? Well, to be very blunt, Algethar Academy, like I said, is the best case study for explaining priority damage. I think a lot of players get really sucked into just doing this big AoE overall pad, but not really understanding what mob they're hitting, why they're hitting this mob, and how to progress further in the dungeon. Today, I wanted to go over exactly what you need to do to adjust that, why priority damage matters, and how it's going to change your outlook completely on specs, classes, and compositions in Mythic Plus. Alright, so we looked at Algethar Academy. What does priority damage look like this season, why is it important, and what kinds of priority damage are there? And how does this impact you as a DPS, healer, or tank player? Let's take a look at Darkflame Cleft. Darkflame Cleft is a 4-boss dungeon with a lot of big mobs in it. However, there's also a lot of chunk mobs like these menial laborers. In the first pull of the dungeon, you're tasked with going in, pulling this first Overseer, pulling these pack moles, these mole herds, and these wick lighters, and if your group decides to, you're going to commit Bloodlust. The thing is, in this pack, there's also dozens of these menial laborers. These menial laborers are what I call pad damage. They do nothing for speeding up the timer in your key, and they're not going to add any value to your keystone whatsoever. The only mobs that matter here before you can continue on the key are killing these 3 mobs. The wick lighter, the mole herd, and the Overseer. Once the Overseer, the wick lighter, and the mole herds are dead, you will be able to chain these pack moles into whatever pack is next, and so forth. Now, why is this a problem? When I've been going into keys lately on my Preservation Evoker, or even lower keys as I was trying to re-gear my brew up a little bit, I was seeing a big problem when going into some of these keys. People don't understand the idea of priority damage, soft prio, and just pad damage. In this pack particularly, you have a priority mob, actually multiple. You have soft Prio mobs, which are like these pack moles, which need to die eventually, but it doesn't matter too much. And you have these pad mobs, which are the meteor laborers. Let's take a different example here. Let's look at Operation Floodgate. Operation Floodgate is a prime example this season of a dungeon that has lots of priority mobs. And why is this important? Have you ever been in the first full of this dungeon? You commit bloodlust, you walk into the shredder, everything is dead, and you're just fighting the shredder alive for 20 seconds because you have a Ret Paladin, a Destro Warlock, and a Devastation Evoker. That's because your comp is missing priority damage, or they're not changing off to single target damage to help make this pull go faster. Contrary to popular belief, big overall doesn't actually mean that the key is being sped up, and a reason why a lot of people are playing with Arcane Mage, and it's very favored. If you're watching MBI, you're watching this as well. Arcane Mage does all its damage through priority funnel, meaning that if you've been to Operation Floodgate and you've done this first pull, you'll probably see the Shredinator die about the same time as everything else. Now, why is this important and why is this failing your keys? When you have one mob alive at the end of a pull, if all your team has been padding, maybe you take a look at Priory of Sacred Flames. If you're just in that first pull and fighting all these mobs and then Guard Captain Solomon's still dead at the end and you're fighting him for 15 or 20 seconds, it means that your team's damage profile is disproportionate. How to solve this is actually not doing things like hitting Divine Storm or Starfall, but it's actually being a little bit ethical and evening out your damage profile over these encounters. I would say that the biggest feedback point that I have to give to a lot of pugs and a lot of groups is figuring out why these mobs matter and how to solve this. This does often mean that sometimes your composition, if you're playing with classes like, Boomkins, Destro Warlocks, Ret Paladins, sometimes have to give up some overall to be more ethical. These are chewing away very valuable seconds at your keystone runs and are inhibiting you of progressing to the next checkpoint. In a lot of dungeons, this is the only thing that matters because sometimes you'll have a time-gated function. Let's look at the first pull in Cinderbrew Meadery, when you're fighting the armed muscles. When going into Cinderbrew, this is an imperative that you kill off these muscles because you can't chain in Chewy until they're dead. This means that it is a priority mob. These mobs often do the most damage to your team, have the most health, or have some sort of mechanic that inhibits you from moving on. In all my dungeons, I have these marked as orange. This particular helps me a lot in tanking, as I know it's going to be the mob that my DPS are hitting, but as well, it reminds me when I'm DPSing or have nameplate clutter that I need to pick these things up and start hitting them. So why does this impact you as a player? I think one of the biggest takeaways I can give to players that are trying to get better at Mythic Plus is understanding damage profiles and understanding how mobs work in dungeons. If you go into a pug dungeon and you're just sitting there fighting that shredder for 5 minutes, or you're unable to fight Chewy because all the mobs are dead but 3 muscles are alive, something's got to give. 1, this could be changing up your composition. 2, this could be changing how you play. Or 3, this could be changing the pulls or routes entirely. Now, I don't want to suggest that you move too much away in this direction unless you're playing with a set team. But often you should be knowledgeable and aware of your composition group strengths and what kind of you have available to you. Arcane Mage and Assassination Rogue have insane priority damage, and there are a lot of specs that funnel off their main target for also doing pretty insane damage as well, like Ellie Shaman, Warrior, and Feral Druid. Often there are classes like Destro Warlock which are hitting Rate of Fire off cooldown, Devastation Evokers hitting Pyre, and as well you do have that famous example of the Ret Paladin hitting Divine Storm. Now, I think before I go forward, how does this impact you and how are you going to fix it? Because I think when I started this rant, I thought about, okay, if I go off and tell people about priority damage and why this matters, and why it's slowing down their keys, how am I going to help them fix it in their keys? It's simple. When you go into a dungeon, you should be swapping up your plater. I have one available, but I don't want to plug mine as I have a very, rural kind of plater. I haven't made too many adjustments on it other than removing some and blacklisting some buffs and adding some colors, but changing the names of priority mobs in dungeons like those Overseers in Darkflame, like those Shredinators in Floodgate, and like those Muscles or Hobgoblins in Cinderbrew are going to be immensely beneficial to you. The reason why is everybody gets cluttered. Tanks, DPS, and healers need to know what they're hitting and why they're hitting it. If you're just a DPS player with basic nameplates or default Plater and you're just hitting, maybe a random mob in the first pull of Cinderbrew, you could be actually doing your team a massive disservice and slowing down your key a lot more than you think it would. Let's take for example as well the drills in Operation Mechagon. You go down after the first boss and you see that there's 8,000 nameplates. You have all these gunks, you have the drill, and you have all these little guys running around. Sometimes it's really easy to get lost in all the clutter and maybe you just start hitting a gunk. This not only is slowing down your key, but drastically increasing the difficulty for your healer and your tank that have to deal with the drill, as well as you having to miss valuable globals on spending additional resource in CCing these gunks. This priority damage is not just about DPS and timer, it's often about safety. In the last part of this video, I wanted to go over briefly the priority mobs in each one of these dungeons and kind of talk a little bit about each of them. Not to spend too much time here, but giving you an example of each mob you should prioritize and start thinking about changing the colors to, or maybe coming up with an action plan to make sure that you as a tank are hitting them or as a DPS. For healers, this is really important too if often you're left stuck healing and you don't know a mob's about to die. Sometimes that scary paladin or that purifier in priority could be dead already and you know that you might get to have a little bit of gas off the brakes on healing. Changing up your nameplates is going to help you a ton, and I'm going to show you here a couple mobs that you should worry about. In Workshop, there are a couple Prio mobs I change colors to as well as casters, but this video is specifically about Prio mobs, so I won't talk about the casters. For one, I always change the color of the battle drills in the second area after the first boss. The first pull too, you can also change the color of these little bombs that are in the pull, just to make it a little bit easier for you to be able to see them and blow them up in case your team doesn't have chains, sigil, and solar beam from a boomkin. Throughout the rest of the dungeon, I also changed the colors of a couple of the mobs at the end, particularly the defenders and as well this tinker, which does a pretty nasty cast on the team I know needs to die first, while these workshop defenders don't matter as much. These defense bots are deadly, and if they blow up really quickly, then you don't have to worry about them AoEing and this pack is going to die more evenly. When in Theater of Pain, there's not too much to worry about priority mobs, but I always mark the Portal Guardian coming out of the Ghost Wing to make sure that I'm not hitting a Soulbinder, but trying to blow up that Portal Guardian so my team doesn't die at the end. I also have a few other mob marks in here, including the gas bag. When going downstairs before Gore Chop, I want to make sure I'm hitting that big gas bag so that whole pack dies evenly and we get rid of the scariest mob in the dungeon. Motherlode has a ton of priority mobs, but I'm going to show you the 3 most important ones in this entire dungeon. 1, I would make sure that you mark the Azurite extractors with a different color. Make sure that these are the mobs you're hitting, as they have infinitely more health than the sappers. I think it's about double the health of the sappers and earthshapers, so you definitely want to be hitting these throughout the pack. If you're hitting the earthshapers and the sappers, you're going to be stuck fighting this extractor forever. So making sure that you highlight it as the priority mob that you're hitting as a tank or as a DPS is your imperative. I also marked the mini boss, the Taskmaster Ascari, with orange, as he lives the longest too, but I'm not going to talk him too much, so I think that's pretty straightforward. When in the trash after the second boss, I always mark the Masterminds and the Weapon Testers with orange. These are the 2 scariest mobs in here, and again, they have the most health. When all these mobs die more evenly and more at the same time, this inhibits your group from being able to move on if they don't die immediately. However, if they do die, this allows your group to chain and bring in that second mastermind or another weapon tester if needed. Lastly, I'm sure you've been in this last area in Motherlode and just gotten absolutely trapped by some of these ordnance specialists and these war machines. I always change the color of the war machines and the specialists to orange or red, and I just leave the mines as null. That way, when I'm in this pull, all I know is I have to be hitting the ordnance specialists and the war machine, and I don't have to worry about that big guy. In Floodgate, these are the 3 mobs that I'm going to tell you that you should be marking, however there are a lot more. Most importantly is the Architect and the Shredder. How many times have you been in Floodgates and you've been fighting the second or third pull in the dungeon and everything's dead except you're fighting a scaffolding on an Architect with 50 million health left? This sucks, and if you think about it too, you've probably been sitting here fighting it for 15-20 seconds at a time. This is 15 or 20 seconds off your entire key, and guess what? If you did it the first time, chances are the second time you fight the Architect's going to be no different in this key. Having 2 mobs alive for 20 to 40 seconds, fighting them on your own is a massive time loss and could be the difference between you timing and depleting that key pending a couple deaths. I do put the Shrednator in here as well, as it has more health than any other mob. And as well, another mark target that I really appreciate is marking these snipers or these demolitionists. These actually don't have more health than a lot of these pulls, however they are deadly, meaning that if the demolitionists die first, you won't have to worry about stopping them or moving around too much. Lastly, and one of the ones that I want to talk about, is the Blood Warper, which is pretty self-explanatory. When you're fighting the Blood Warper in this dungeon, you want to make sure that it is your primary nameplate, as leaving this alive too long could kill your tank, your healer, or your DPS. I do have the jump starters marked as well, just with the color orange at the end, as some pulls or some routes are going to involve pulling them with a bunch of different mobs, but I digress on that one. Rookery is also an amazing dungeon for marking colored mobs. Specifically, Rookery has a ton of mobs, including the Void Riders in the upper area and as well the Diffusers in the lower area. In the very first pull, you have that Quartermaster Koratite, and you could possibly have a Void Rider. I always make sure that I'm marking my targets orange in these dungeons to make sure that I'm hitting the right things and evening out that pack on my Boomkin, or especially to building on my Vengeance Demon Hunter. My VDH Prio is insane with Eldrazi Reaver, and throwing those glaives into the Void Riders is very much a time save in this key. When going downstairs, remember that you also want to be hitting the Diffusers. These are the most dangerous mob in the dungeon, and marking these with a different color and separating them from the rest of the pack is absolutely a huge time save, and not only that, is going to save your team a lot of uptime. Remember, when Diffusers are casting over and over and over again, and if they're the last mobs alive in the pack, you're going to have to deal with their little Void Zone suck in, as well as having to press defensives, go into Bear, or LOS their Arcing Bolts. Lastly, there are mobs downstairs that do matter, and I like to whitelist or blacklist all my afflicted civilians and turn them the color white. That way, when I'm fighting Void Ascendants or I'm fighting the Radiating Voidstone, I know not to even bother dotting them or hitting the civilians other than to get threats. My damage on these things does not matter whatsoever, and the only thing that's going to speed up my dungeon is hitting the Ascendants and the Voidstones. In Darkflame, I went over a couple of these mobs, but most importantly, I would make sure that you're marking the Overseers, which are going to help you a ton. The Wandering Candles, which are the big mobs in this area and your priority targets, and as well at the end, probably the most important out of everything is making sure you're hitting these Corridor Creepers in the Mineguard area. The Corridor Creepers do have the most health, and effectively they should be the target you're hitting. However, you have to also realize too that your tank could be on a finite lifespan. As well, your healer has to heal your tank through all these creepers, and if they're not dying and everything else is alive, or you're just spamming Divine Storm on the little skitters, you're actually causing a more circular problem. The faster that these little skitters die and these Corridor Creepers are alive, the more corpses are going to be around them, increasing the damage that these Corridor Creepers are going to do to your tank, and reducing the chance that he's going to live. We talked about Cinderbrew Meadery a little bit, and you can watch a video to go over how many brown mobs there are in here, but I'm going to go over the 3 most important ones just for time. In the first pull, you definitely want to be marking those muscles. You've probably seen before, in some of my videos, I always have the hired muscles marked as orange. I have Chewy marked as orange, and as well, going in, I always have my Hobgoblins, and as well, my Ventrico Honey Harvesters marked as orange. These again are all the deadly big mobs that need to die immediately in the dungeon and have the most health. Evening these out or swapping from that Starfall to Star Surge to help even out damage a little bit is going to speed up your key a lot. Lastly, I do have Priory. Now, I might have to actually go into an entire other video for Priory, but I always make sure I mark all the mini bosses, Guard Captain Solomon, Tainer, and as well Sergeant with the color orange. That way, when all these mobs are in, I'm not just hitting a sharpshooter or a defender, and as well when I'm in Bloodlust, I'm making sure I hit those Starfires or that Reaver's Glaive into Guard Captain Solomon. This is probably the biggest time loss I've seen in any key from a lot of my groups, where they just simply, if you don't have an Arcane Mage, they refuse to either hit this mob, or they just get lazy and start blowing up their CDs into a Priest, into a Footman, or something else. Lastly, as well, I have marked the Purifiers and the Paladins with a different color, but again too, there's so many different mob casts and colors in here that I think the biggest ones that you really need to do are the mini bosses, the Paladins, the Purifiers, and maybe at the end you could argue maybe making sure that you also put in Sir Braunpike as a priority target. Anyway, those are my top mobs from each dungeon that I wanted to go over, explaining priority damage and why this matters. In a couple final remarks, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, how much of a difference that this is going to make in your keys, and it's going to be very, very, very noticeable if you're playing a DPS or a tank. Why do I say tank? It's because often people don't really understand when they lose threat on something when they're tanking these mobs, and they don't realize their DPS are cognizant of what the priority mobs need to be. If I'm an arcane mage, I'm going to be hitting the architect, I'm going to be hitting the shreddinator, I'm going to be hitting the muscle. And I've been so frustrated with some of my keys when I'm healing or I'm DPSing where my tank is just not hitting the priority mob. This is going to help you a ton in just marking these things down and making sure that your Reaper's Glaive is hitting them. As a DPS, this is going to be immensely helpful to you understanding how to even out damage in these pulls and why you see people in the top keys just obliterate these pulls a lot faster than maybe some of your pugs do. One, composition does matter a lot, but let's throw that out the window for a sec. If you're playing a red paladin, or if you're playing a boomkin and you're in one of these pulls and you see you don't have an arcane mage or sin rogue, take the DPS hit. I guarantee you just swapping out sometimes and just helping even out that prowl mob or killing it off is not only going to be safer for your team, but it's going to help actually speed up your timer a ton. Lastly, for healers, and I think that this is a less important note, but it does help a little bit. Sometimes I just dump all my healer damage into one mob, and having them marked is a good indicator for you if you're just looking up on the fly to see what's still alive. Even in workshop, I have the dogs marked, so at all times when we're fighting gunks and dogs at the same time, I get to see what those mobs' health is at, how much longer I need to prep, and how many healing CDs I need to go and save if I'm going to be fighting 4 or 5 dogs for a prolonged period of time. Anyway, on this video of Ryerson Explains, hopefully this helped you understand priority boss damage and mob damage a little bit better and why it's slowing down your Mythic Plus routes. Think I missed anything or think I missed the mark completely? Feel free to drop something in the comments, but otherwise, hopefully this was a good addendum to my last video on how to get better at Mythic Plus. With that in mind, thanks for all the support, thanks for all the feedback, and hopefully too, this video helps you in chasing title this season or getting better at the specs you play. Is there anything else you guys would like to see from my channel? Feel free to, again, drop something in the comments or come join my Discord and join the conversation. I'll catch you guys in the next one.